going to do today is I'm going to start introducing, first of all, the kind of the background of participatory research and ask-based methods. Then I will delve into some examples from my own research, and I will come up with the conclusions that is basically a three-part argument that I'm trying to make, that the relationship between creative methods and participatory research is not as simple as straightforward as many of us may be led to believe. So first of all, we need to consider what the participatory research actually is or means, and how it's kind of developed over time. So clearly participatory research is first of all an opportunity to investigate questions of hierarchy and power, and also location of knowledge, and it's trying to recognize the expertise research participants bring. So in that sense, it really tries to engage individuals through handing over the responsibility within the research process. So what is at forefront of any kind of participatory work really is, whose research is it? What's the purpose of this research, and how can this be, used in further developments and dissemination? So as such, participatory research really is considered as a political and activist way of doing research and exploring knowledge. However, it's not as simple as that, because according to Tandon, I mean, I know that this goes back to 1988, but we do have to kind of, make a starting point somewhere. And according to Tandon, there are three particular criteria that make research participatory. So first of all, in order to identify a research as participatory, we have to acknowledge that participants have a role in setting the agenda of the inquiry, and that then the participants are taking part in the data collection and the analysis. And finally, that the participants have a control over the use of the outcome and the whole process. This brings us back to the point that participatory research is considered as political and activist, because it is using the research participants as experts in their fields, and therefore they have to be part of the process. So what we're doing here really is making a distinction between involvement and participation. So on the one hand, a lot of the research projects are involving expert participants, for example, in health research, or consumers in market research, where participants are asked about their experiences. So they're involving participants, not actually asking them to participate. So participation is at a more intense level. It's a more equal level. It's really an egalitarian way of looking at research. So in that sense, what we can deduct from all of these sort of background information is that really there is a continuum of participatory research, where on the one end we've got little or superficial or minimal involvement of the participants, and on the other end we have got research projects where the participants are co-researchers, and they're not even dealing with or behaving as participants. They are really involved and engaged at the different levels of involvement and engagement and participation in the research. In reality, we are probably looking, for most participatory projects, we're probably looking at somewhere in the middle between the two extremes. It's very difficult to identify a participatory project where the participants are co-researchers at all levels. Now, if we're looking as a second stage into the creative and arts-based approaches, obviously creative and arts-based methods are no different to any other category within any kind of discourses we find. Definitions are always difficult, and terms change depending on people's disciplinary conventions and outlooks, but largely creative and arts-based methods are seen as drawing on artistic or playful forms of expression, and the arts-based approaches are used for their powers of expression, their element and their powers of evocation and illumination. So the emphasis really is on radical, politically grounded social justice. So again, we've got the kind of the similarity here to the participatory approaches to research, where it is using creative and arts-based methods is meant to help minimize the hierarchy between the researcher and the participants. It's trying to reduce the power differential between the researcher and the participants, and it's calling for action because the arts-based approach is specifically looking at illuminating and evoking and expressing experiences. So as such, there is this element of an emotional connection of trying to call for action to develop that kind of experience. As such, I would just like to very quickly highlight some forms of creative and arts-based methods. Obviously, there are many, many different ones, but largely we're talking about elicitation approaches, things like narratives, vignettes, visual materials and representations, photo elicitation, so work with photographs. We've also got elements where creative methods are used for artistic workshops. So the artistic workshop is an opportunity to collect data or to analyze data or to disseminate data. And then obviously there are all sorts of different forms of diary methods as well, with timelines and photographs again, or visual materials, drawing, sketching, narrative approaches. There is literally no limit in what kind of approach is being used as part of the creative and arts-based method. What I would like to delve into now is 3 examples from my own research to demonstrate that actually the relationship between the creative arts-based approach and the participatory approach to research is not always clear-cut and straightforward. I would like to reiterate that within the participatory work, there is a continuum. And actually, as a matter of fact, when we're looking at some of these examples, we will see that in reality, we're dipping in and out of the participatory element throughout the research. So I'm drawing up on 3 particular examples. The first case study that I would like to mention is where I was collaborating with students to develop new methods to teach reflective practice. I was working at the time as a teacher educator on a master's level Master of Teaching program. And part of that program was to instill reflective practice and to basically embed reflective practice as much as possible. And the students found they were using all the reflective models, but they found that they weren't engaging very well with the kind of models that they were given. So we were experimenting with different forms of how we could use reflective practice. And as part of that, we developed the river of learning. We used Lego models, so we were experimenting with different forms. The second case study I would like to highlight is where I was collaborating with students on assessments. I was at the time teaching on a BA Education Studies program on a module which was called Language, Literacy and Communication. And the idea of the module was that literacy practices are different, not just about reading and writing, and that throughout our lives we learn different forms of literacy. We've got different kinds of knowledge and skills that we develop and learn, and that communication is intrinsically more than just the word. However, as some of the students pointed out, there was a discrepancy between the module content and how the module was assessed, because the assessment was an essay, and students were highlighting that this discrepancy is something that's really against the content of the module. So we were working together on trying to find ways of how we could change assessments where the students would be allowed to decide on how they would want to be assessed. The final case study I would like to highlight is from a research project that I've undertaken at the University of Kent. This was about the construction of academic identity under the influence of fibromyalgia. Now, fibromyalgia is a chronic condition which is similar to chronic fatigue syndrome. It's characterized by widespread pain, psychological dysfunction, sleep disorders, chronic fatigue as well, actually. So there is a lot of different symptoms that basically highlight, that somebody may have fibromyalgia, but really the problem is that fibromyalgia cannot be found in any kind of medical test. So it's the last thing that remains if everything else comes back as fine and negative. And the other thing is the problem with fibromyalgia is that the symptoms wax and wane throughout the day, and they move around on the people's bodies as well. So it's really difficult to identify whether you have fibromyalgia or not. And I was particularly interested in trying to identify how people make sense of their academic identity, if they've got bodies that are failing them, if they've got cognitive dysfunctions, so therefore, things like brain fog, sequencing issues, word retrieval problems. How can you make sense of your academic identity as somebody who's supposed to be cerebrally functioning at all times, and when physically your body is letting you down, essentially? And as part of that, participants were required to build representations using objects as metaphors, and they were required to create representations of their experiences. What I would like to highlight here is that in all of these three projects, I've outlined that I have been collaborating with people, with my research participants. But so in that sense, yes, they were participatory, and on paper, they probably look very, very much involving and engaging participants. However, if we're looking very, very objectively at what's happening at the different stages in the research, it becomes very clear that it's not a fully egalitarian project. So, for example, if I'm highlighting here in the first part of this image, the formulation of the research question, yes, in case study 1 and 2, it did come out from the work of the students, where the students were highlighting that there is a problem or something that needs to be investigated. Case studies 3, it was very much my research, was very much my identity, my kind of identity question that I wanted to explore. There was no scope for the research participants to feed into that. On the data collection or data generation stage, if you look here, case study 2 with the assessments, letting students decide, there was no real data collection that allowed them to be involved. However, when it comes to disseminating findings again, they were the ones that were actually taking a lead on it. They were trying to find different ways of where they could present at conferences, how they could publish an article, etc., etc. So they were very, very heavily involved in that stage again. By contrast, case study 3, as you can see, the data collection and the data analysis is very much participatory, because the participants were the ones that obviously generated the representations, but they also made sense of those representations in interviews. So once we had all of the objects together, we were discussing them. And when we look at my interview transcripts, they are genuinely conversations between two people trying to make sense of what those objects mean and what therefore the whole experience means for the broader in public, or for the broader audience, in this case, academics with fibromyalgia. On the other hand, if we're looking at the arts-based approach, case study 2 actually did not have any arts-based approach involved at all. And this is what I'm trying to say. A lot of the time, people think that using creative methods automatically makes something a participatory research. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't, that relationship is not given. So if I'm looking at case study 3, where a lot of the approaches, a lot of the elements, where the data collection, data analysis, and dissemination of findings was very, very heavily involved in arts-based approaches. If we're looking at, by comparison to that, if we're looking at the participatory element of those in those 3 case studies, it's actually not more participatory than case studies 1 and 2. Although the engagement of the arts was a lot heavier, there was a lot more engagement with the arts. So really, the relationship between creative methods and participatory approaches to research is somewhat fraught and more complex than it may look. What's important to understand at this particular stage is that the current understanding of the community-based participatory action research is not the only potential for participatory methods. As we've seen, there is a continuum, and that's really, really important to recognize. But I'm going a step further. Actually, it should not be. We should not see this way of looking at participatory methods as the only way of actually identifying what it means. Realistically, most participatory research designs are situated between two extremes of the continuum, and the employment of the arts-based methods does not necessarily translate into participatory research design, as I have just shown. What I would like to conclude with is, at the end of the day, what's really, really important is, in some cases, for ethical reasons, the researcher should not even aim for a fully egalitarian research because we have to maintain the participants' interests and well-being. So if I'm going back to the example number 2, case study 2, assessments, letting students decide, for example, had I developed that as a fully egalitarian project where the students would literally be running off on their own and doing whatever they wanted to do, that would mean they would potentially get off on a tangent on their assessment. Therefore, they would possibly not be able to be assessed against the module criteria. As a consequence, they would actually harm themselves in the sense that they would actually, in a way, sabotage their own research, their own assessment results. So this is a very, very specific example where it's very clear that we can't let people run off and do their own thing on their own. Equally, if we're looking at things like reflective practice or the fibromyalgia research, for example, again, it's very important that the role of the researcher needs to be in place. We can't let our participants run off and do their own thing simply because it's our responsibility to make sure that their interests are recognized and acknowledged, and that actually their well-being and health remain at the forefront of our own work. And that's really the important element of trying to do participatory research, especially in combination with creative methods, because often those things are unleashing particular kinds of experiences in participants where, again, the researcher's responsibility remains that to look after the research participants.